Chester Puitt pointed at her like she was something he'd found stuck to the bottom of his boot. "I can't marry that." He said it loud enough for the whole platform to hear, loud enough for the station master to stop counting tickets, for the women by the water barrel to turn around, for the group of cowboys near the fence post to start grinning at each other like something shameful was happening, and they were glad to watch it. Eliza Rowan stood 12 feet away from the man she had spent 4 months writing letters to, her suitcase in her right hand, her left hand holding the brim of her hat against the Wyoming wind, and she heard every word. She felt every eye. She watched Chester Puitt straighten his collar and step back like she might contaminate him, and she understood in that single second that the life she had packed herself up and traveled 600 miles to build had just been unmade in front of a crowd of strangers. If that were you standing on that platform, what would you have done? This is the story of Eliza Rowan, the woman Chester Puitt threw away and Silas Boone saw clearly for the first time. If this story moves something in you, subscribe to this channel and follow Eliza's journey all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to that train platform. The train had come in 20 minutes late, which meant Eliza had 20 extra minutes to be nervous. She had used most of them standing at the window of the passenger car, watching the Wyoming landscape flatten out beneath a sky that looked too big for anything human to live under comfortably. She wasn't from wide-open places. She'd grown up in a mill town in Pennsylvania where the buildings leaned toward each other like old men comparing ailments, where the sky appeared mostly as a stripe between rooftops. The space out here unsettled her in a way she hadn't anticipated, and she gripped her suitcase handle a little harder than necessary and told herself that unease was not the same thing as a mistake. She had written 4 months' worth of letters to Chester Puitt. She had his handwriting memorized, the way he looped his lowercase g's and pressed too hard on the paper when he was emphasizing something, which made certain words slightly raised to the touch. She had read those letters so many times that she could recite passages without thinking. Character is what endures. Beauty is weather. A woman who knows her own mind is worth more to me than a woman who merely pleases the eye. He had written that in his 3rd letter, and she had read it to her sister Clara over the kitchen table, and Clara had said, "Well, that sounds like a good man." And Eliza had thought so too. She was 31 years old. She was not remarkable to look at. She knew that, had always known it with the steady acceptance of someone who learned early that there are things you can change and things you cannot, and wasting grief on the second kind is a poor use of time. Her nose had a bump in the middle from a fall she'd taken off a fence when she was 9. Her hair was brown and mostly refused to do what she asked of it. She was thin in the way that comes not from delicacy, but from a life that kept her moving and didn't always remember to feed her. She had good eyes, clear gray, steady, and her mother had told her that a person's eyes were the one thing they couldn't fake, and that hers showed someone honest, which was worth more than most things a person could offer. She had tried to believe that. She had the letters. She had the agreement. She had Chester Puitt's word. She stepped off the train onto the platform at Silver Hollow, Wyoming, and she looked for him in the crowd. She found him immediately because he was exactly as he'd described himself, tall, light hair, wearing the brown jacket with the brass buttons. He was watching the train, watching the passengers disembark. He hadn't seen her yet, and she had one strange, suspended moment of watching him before he turned his eyes in her direction, and she lifted her free hand in a small wave, and his expression did something she couldn't immediately name. He went still. That was the first thing. He went entirely still, the way an animal does when it sees something unexpected and hasn't decided yet whether to approach it or walk away. And then he looked at her. Really looked, the kind of looking that travels from head to boot and back again. And she watched the decision happen on his face in real time. He didn't walk toward her. He turned to the man standing beside him, a heavy-set fellow in a town clerk's coat, and he said something. She was still too far away to hear it. The heavy-set man looked at her. Chester looked at her again. And then Chester said it loud enough that the looking stopped being private. "I can't marry that." 11 words, 4 of them hers. The platform did not go silent. It was a train platform. There was always noise, luggage, and greetings, and the last hissing exhalations of the engine. But the particular cluster of people near Chester Puitt went quiet in the way that people do when they smell blood and don't want to miss what comes next. Eliza heard a woman somewhere behind her make a soft, involuntary sound. She heard a man laugh, short and mean, quickly swallowed. She stood holding her suitcase, and she did not move. She had imagined many versions of this arrival. Awkwardness, she had imagined. A first handshake that was too formal. The strange silence of two people who know each other only through paper meeting in 3 dimensions for the first time. She had imagined he might be different than she expected, or that she might be. She had not imagined this. Chester turned fully away from her and spoke to the clerk again, this time in a lower voice. And whatever he said made the clerk look at her with something that was worse than the laughter. It was pity mixed with relief, the look of a man glad that someone else's humiliation is not his own. Eliza's grip on her suitcase handle had gone white-knuckled without her noticing. Her face felt very warm. Her feet, she realized distantly, were not moving. Move, she told herself. She was not going to stand here. She was not going to give Silver Hollow, Wyoming, the image of a woman frozen on a train platform while a man cataloged her inadequacies for public entertainment. She had $11 and a return train she could not afford and a sewing kit in the bottom of her bag, and she was not going to stand here. She picked a direction, away from Chester Puit, away from the cluster of watchers, and she walked. Not fast enough to look like fleeing, not slow enough to suggest she had nowhere to go. She aimed herself at the far end of the platform, and she walked with her chin level and her eyes straight ahead, and she breathed through her nose, and she did not cry. She made it approximately 40 feet before her heel caught a gap in the platform boards. It wasn't a fall. She caught herself, grabbed the railing, stayed upright, but it was enough to make her stumble, and stumbling was enough to make the watching easier. She heard someone's breath catch in that particular way people breathe when they're witnessing an accident, ready to be entertained or concerned depending on how it landed. She recovered herself, kept walking, and did not look back to see who had watched. She stopped at the far end of the platform where there was a bench and a water barrel and a posted schedule for the next eastbound train, and she set her suitcase down and she looked at the schedule and she looked at the $11 she was carrying, and she did the arithmetic that people do when the life they had planned suddenly becomes unavailable and they need to calculate what comes next. The next eastbound train left in 4 days. She had enough money for perhaps 2 nights in a boarding house, if Silver Hollow had one. If it didn't, she had less. She had her sewing kit, and she had her hands, and she had whatever work she could find in the next 4 days in a town that had already seen her humiliated at the train station and would not quickly forget it. She stood there doing arithmetic, and she didn't notice the man until he was already standing a few feet away. He wasn't looking at her when she first registered him. I was looking out at the street beyond the platform, one hand in his coat pocket, the other holding the reins of a horse tied loosely to the corner post. He was not a big man, not remarkable in any way she could immediately identify. Medium height, dark hair that needed cutting, a coat that had been mended at both elbows. He looked like someone who worked hard in weather. He looked like someone who was used to waiting and had made his peace with it. He turned and saw her looking at him, and he didn't look away or look embarrassed. He met her eyes directly and nodded once, the way people do when they're acknowledging something without adding to it. "Hard welcome," he said. It was not a question, and it was not an apology on Chester Puit's behalf, and it was not pity. It was simply the plain naming of what had happened, and something about its plainness hit her in the sternum in a way she hadn't expected. She had been bracing against the kind of sympathy that makes things worse, the soft voices, the tilted heads, the "oh, you poor dear" that makes you feel the wound fresh each time someone else touches it. This man wasn't doing that. He was just saying, yes, that was hard. He said it and waited, and she found she could breathe. "Yes," she said. He looked at her suitcase and then back at her. "You have somewhere to stay?" "I'm looking into it. Silver Hollow's got one boarding house, Mrs. Taggart's. She's fair." He paused. "It's not cheap." "I can manage." She heard her own voice and knew she wasn't convincing either of them, and apparently he heard it too because he didn't argue, but he also didn't leave. "I'm Silas Boone," he said. "I ranch east of town." "Eliza Rowan." He nodded. He already knew who she was. Everyone on the platform had heard Chester Puit say it with the particular clarity of a man who doesn't care who hears him, and word in a small town moves like fire in dry grass. She could see that he knew, and she waited for whatever came after knowing, and what came after was nothing she had prepared for. "I came to town for supplies," Silas Boone said. And I've been thinking since I watched you walk down that platform that I have a question to ask. And I'd rather ask it plainly than dance around it and waste your time." She looked at him. She said nothing. "I have 2 daughters," he said. 6 years old, both of them. Their mother died 18 months ago, and I've been managing alone since, which I can tell you is not working as well as I'd like. I need someone steady in the house. I can offer wages, a room of your own, and honest work. That's what I have." He said it the way he'd said everything else, directly, without flourish, without any attempt to make it sound better than it was. "I know that's not what you came here for. I know it's not what you planned. But I thought you should have an option that isn't the eastbound train in 4 days." Eliza looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the mended elbows of his coat. She looked at the horse, which was an ordinary brown horse with good, clean eyes. She looked at the schedule on the wall behind her and then back at Silas Boone. "You watched that happen," she said. "Everything on that platform." "Yes." "And that's when you decided to offer me work." "That's when I decided to come ask," he said. "You could have broken down. You could have made a scene that would have followed you for years. Instead, you picked up your bag and walked. That told me something. It told you I can take humiliation without collapsing. It told me you're steady," he said. "That's what I need." She thought about Clara, back in Pennsylvania, who had hugged her at the station and said, "Write me the moment you arrive," and was probably already waiting for a letter. She thought about Chester Puitt's brass buttons and his particular handwriting. She thought about the 4 months of letters, the hope she had packed up along with her sewing kit and her $11, the life she'd made herself believe was waiting for her out here. She thought about the schedule on the wall. "What are your daughters' names?" she asked. Something shifted in his face. It was small, barely perceptible, but she caught it. "Hazel and Ruby," he said. "They argue constantly, about everything. They argued about what color the sky is for 20 minutes last week, and neither of them was entirely wrong." Eliza Rowan almost smiled. She didn't, not quite, but the impulse was there, which was more than she had expected to feel in the next several days. "How far is your ranch?" she said. 3 hours by wagon." "And the wages?" He named a figure. It was modest and it was honest, and she could see from the way he said it that he wasn't going to argue about it. "I want it clear," she said, "that I am considering this as employment, not as anything else." "That's all I'm offering," he said. "And if it doesn't suit either of us, I'm free to leave." "You're free to leave regardless," he said. "I'm not Chester Puitt." She picked up her suitcase. "Show me where your wagon is," she said. What nobody in Silver Hollow understood, what Chester Puitt certainly didn't understand, though understanding things about Eliza had never seemed to interest him, was that she had not arrived in Wyoming fragile. The fragility people assigned to her was their own projection, the assumption that a woman rejected publicly must be shattered, must need rescuing, must spend her next several days weeping quietly somewhere. They were looking at what happened to her and deciding what it meant for her insides, and they were wrong. She was angry. That was the truer thing. Under the steadiness, under the chin-level walk and the careful arithmetic, there was anger, and she had learned a long time ago that anger could be a fuel or a fire, and the difference was whether you decided what to do with it before it decided for you. She had grown up watching her mother make decisions under pressure. Her father had died when Eliza was 12. Mill accident, the kind that happened with grim regularity and produced grim familiarity in the women who lived nearby. And her mother had stood at the stove 3 days later and looked at Eliza and her sister and said, "We have what we have. Let's make something from it." Not dramatic, not delivered with tears, just the plain statement of a woman who understood that grief was real and collapse was optional. Eliza had been making something from what she had ever since. What she had now, a wagon seat, a 3-hour ride east into the Wyoming interior, and a job she hadn't planned on. Silas Boone drove the wagon with the economy of a man who had driven this road many times and didn't need to think about it, which left him occasionally available for something approximating conversation. I was not, she quickly understood, a man who filled silence with noise. He said things when he had things to say, and otherwise sat with the silence as if it were perfectly companionable, which she found she didn't mind. She had spent 4 months writing letters to a man who turned out to be a performance of thoughtfulness rather than the real thing. And sitting next to someone who simply existed without performing was a relief she hadn't known she needed. "What do they do," she said, "when you're out on the ranch?" "Who?" "Hazel and Ruby." He considered this with the same seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. Hazel organizes things, puts them in rows. She organized the tin cups by height last month, smallest to tallest, and got extremely upset when I used one out of order. He said it without smiling, but without irritation either, just describing it. Ruby takes things apart. She took apart one of my good bridles to see how it was assembled and then couldn't get it back together. She felt terrible about it. She tried to fix it for 2 days. Did she? No, but she got closer than I expected. Eliza looked out at the landscape and thought about a girl who disassembled bridles and couldn't quite reassemble them, but kept trying for 2 days. How did their mother die? She asked. She asked it directly because she thought he would prefer directness, and she thought correctly. He didn't flinch or retreat into careful language. Fever, he said. Spring of last year. It went fast. I'm sorry. Yes, he said. Simply that. Yes. They rode in silence for a while. The road dipped into a shallow valley and climbed out again, and the light was going golden and long, the particular quality of late afternoon in high country that makes everything look more significant than it probably is. Eliza had her sewing kit in her lap, habit more than need, and she turned it in her hands without thinking. I should tell you, she said, that I am not a woman who does things by halves. If I'm caring for children, I'll care for them properly. If I'm keeping house, the house will actually be kept. I'm not decorative. I didn't think you were. Chester Puett did. Silas said nothing. He wanted something decorative, she said. He wrote letters about character because he thought it sounded good. What he actually wanted was something he liked looking at. She paused. She hadn't planned to say this, but it had come out evenly, without the heat she might have expected. That's his problem, not mine. I want to be clear about what I am, so we don't end up in a similar misunderstanding. Silas was quiet for a moment, watching the road. Then he said, My wife was remarkable. I spent 3 years being glad every day that she existed. Another pause. She looked like someone you'd notice. But that wasn't the thing. The thing was, she knew what needed doing, and she did it. That was the thing. He glanced at Eliza briefly, the way he seemed to do everything. Without excess, without drama. Character was not a phrase she used because it sounded good. Eliza looked at the road ahead of them. All right, she said. They didn't speak again for a while, and the silence this time was different. Not awkward, not careful, just two people sitting with the information they'd exchanged, letting it settle. The ranch appeared as the sun was dropping below the ridge, which meant Eliza's first impression of it was mercy light, the kind that softens things, makes the ragged edges glow instead of sag. She understood this even as it was happening, made herself note it. This is good light, not a good picture. She made herself look at what was actually there. The cabin was standing. That much she could say. The fence lines were maintained with the thoroughness of a man who had too much else to do, but understood that unfixed fences meant lost livestock meant a different kind of catastrophe. The barn was in better shape than the cabin, which told her something about priorities. The animals came first, and she didn't fault him for it. The kitchen garden alongside the south wall of the cabin was not a garden so much as a memory of one, the kind of thing that had once been tended and was now surviving purely on its own stubbornness. A woman was coming out of the cabin door with a baby on her hip. Not a baby, Eliza revised, a small child. And then Eliza understood that the woman must be a neighbor, someone who'd been watching the girls while Silas went to town, because she had that particular efficient posture of someone completing a borrowed obligation and ready to go home. Behind the woman's legs, two identical small faces were peering around the doorframe, one on top of the other like they'd stacked themselves. Mr. Boone, the woman said, and she looked at Eliza with the unambiguous assessment of a woman who has heard things and is now seeing them in person. Mrs. Calloway, thank you for staying. Said Mrs. Calloway, and said it in the particular way of a woman who has opinions she is going to share somewhere else later, at volume. She passed Silas without further comment, and walked down the path toward where, presumably, her own wagon was waiting, and she did not look back, which was more of a statement than any words she might have added. The two small faces came out from behind the doorframe. They were identical in the way that made Eliza's eyes do a quick back and forth, looking for the distinguishing detail. She found it. The one on the left had a small cut healing at her chin, and the one on the right was standing with her arms crossed at her chest, already assessing. This is Hazel and Ruby, Silas said. He did not specify which was which, and she understood she was expected to figure it out herself. She crouched down to their level without making a production of it. "I'm Eliza," she said. "Your father hired me to help with the house." The one with the cut chin looked at her with the open, provisional acceptance of a child who has not yet learned to be guarded. The one with the crossed arms looked at her the way Mrs. Calloway had looked at her, like someone gathering information before committing. "Did you come on the train?" said the arms-crossed one. "I did." "Papa said that someone was supposed to marry Mr. Pruitt," she said. "Did you?" "No," Eliza said. "Why not?" "Ruby," Silas said from behind Eliza. "It's a fair question," Eliza said. She looked at Ruby. She was certain now it was Ruby, the one who took things apart to see how they worked. And she said simply, "He decided he didn't want to." Ruby took this in with the seriousness of a child processing new data. "That was rude," she said. "Yes," said Eliza. "It was." "Hazel cried when Mama died," Ruby said, as if this were relevant and she'd decided to offer it. "I didn't cry right away. I cried later by myself. I don't know if that's better or worse." Eliza was not prepared for this. She absorbed it. "I think there's no right time," she said after a moment. "I think crying when you need to is the same whether it's right away or later." Ruby looked at her for another long moment. Then she uncrossed her arms. "Your hair's coming out," she said, pointing at the side of Eliza's head where several strands had escaped during the wagon ride. "It usually does." "Mama's did that too." Hazel, who had not spoken yet, slipped her hand into Eliza's without any preamble, the way small children do when they've made a decision that needs no discussion. Eliza looked down at the small fingers wrapped around hers, and she did not allow her face to do whatever it wanted to do, because she was standing in a stranger's doorway, and she had only been here 5 minutes, and she was not going to come apart over the simple, uncalculated trust of a 6-year-old. "Can you show me the house?" Eliza said. Hazel pulled her forward without letting go, and Eliza let herself be led, and Silas Boone stood on the porch and watched the three of them go inside with an expression that nobody was looking at, and that would have been difficult to name if they had been. The inside of the cabin was what she had expected, and also slightly worse. Not dirty, Silas kept it above that, but stripped down, efficient in the way of a man living in a house, and not really inhabiting it, keeping things functional without keeping them alive. The curtains were practical rather than chosen. The table had a crack in it that had been repaired well but never sanded smooth. The kitchen was the heart of any home, and this one had the particular flatness of a kitchen where nobody cooked with any pleasure anymore, where food was prepared because it had to be and eaten for the same reason. Ruby showed her everything with the methodical tour guide manner of a child who does not do things by halves either, which made Eliza like her immediately, and with some wariness, because she recognized it. "That's where Mama kept her good dish," Ruby said, pointing at an empty space on the shelf. Then, "I dropped it, last winter." "It broke?" "Yes." Ruby looked at the empty space. "Papa said it was all right, but he looked sad." Hazel squeezed Eliza's hand. There was one small room off the main cabin. It had been a pantry once, or possibly a washroom, difficult to tell now. There was a cot in it and a hook on the wall and a single small window that looked east, though it was too dark now to see what the window looked at. "That's where Mrs. Calloway's been sleeping," Ruby said. "She didn't like it. She said there was a draft." "There probably is," Eliza said. "We can fix that." Ruby looked at her with a precise, considering look. "Mrs. Calloway said she couldn't fix it." "Then we'll fix it differently than Mrs. Calloway would have." Ruby blinked, processed this, filed it. Silas brought in her suitcase and set it by the door of the small room. "It's not much," he said. The same directness. He did not apologize for it or try to make it sound better. "It's something," she said. "That's enough to start with." She was on her knees that night, not out of sentiment, just practicality, examining the draft along the baseboard. It was coming from a gap where the corner board had shifted slightly away from the wall, probably seasonal, the way wood moves when it gets cold and contracts. She had no sealant, but she had cloth strips from the bottom of the fabric roll she'd packed for sewing, and she packed them in while Hazel and Ruby watched from the doorway, both of them holding candles, shadows large behind them. "Will that work?" Hazel said. Her first full sentence of the evening. "Probably," Eliza said. We'll know by morning if we wake up cold. They didn't. She woke at dawn to the absence of draft and the sound of Ruby already moving around in the main room, doing something that turned out to be reorganizing the wood stack by size, for reasons she explained at some length. Eliza made breakfast. It was nothing special. She had a fire built and water on, and she made use of what was in the kitchen, which required some creativity with limited supplies. But she cooked it with care, which is different from cooking it with ceremony. Silas came in from the morning chores and looked at the plate in front of him and looked at her and then ate. He said, "That's the first time in a year that food tasted like food." She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "I'll need more eggs." "I'll get them," he said, and went back out. The first morning at the Boone Ranch. Nothing remarkable. Nothing transformed. Just a woman who arrived on a train the day before, and a quiet man who had lost too much, and two small girls who had already started watching the new person in their house and deciding whether to trust her. And outside the window, the Wyoming landscape doing nothing in particular except existing at a scale that said, plainly, that human concerns were small out here, but were not therefore unimportant. Eliza Rowan sat at the table with her tea after the girls went to find their boots, and she looked at the sewing kit she'd set on the windowsill, and she thought about Chester Puig's brass buttons, and she thought about Clara waiting for a letter in Pennsylvania, and she thought about what she would write in it. She thought, "I did not get what I expected. I got something I didn't know to expect. I cannot tell you yet what that means." She thought, "Somewhere in this town a man is telling people he made the right choice, and he will go on believing that for a very long time." She looked at the empty space on the shelf where the good dish had been. She picked up her sewing kit and looked at the curtains, the practical, unchosen ones, and thought about what a person does with a room when they want it to feel less like a waiting area and more like a place where someone actually lives. She thought about the kitchen garden that was surviving on its own stubbornness and what it would need to do more than survive. She thought, "He said I'm steady, so I will be steady. I will be very, very steady, and we will see what steady can build." Outside, Hazel and Ruby were arguing about something. She couldn't hear the words, but she could hear the particular shape of it, the back and forth, the escalation, the pause, where one of them had apparently deployed an unanswerable argument and the other was recovering. It sounded like two people who knew each other deeply enough to disagree with full commitment. She got up and went to find out what they were arguing about. This, she did not know yet, was the beginning of everything. The argument, it turned out, was about the chickens. Specifically, it was about which chickens belonged to whom, a jurisdiction dispute that had apparently been ongoing for several weeks and showed no signs of resolution. Hazel believed that the three brown hens were hers because she had named them first, which established ownership under a legal framework she had invented entirely herself. Ruby believed that naming something did not constitute ownership, and that since she was the one who remembered to check for eggs every morning, the eggs, and by extension the hens who produced them, were logically hers. Eliza stood in the yard and listened to approximately 45 seconds of this before she said, "What are their names?" Hazel looked at her. "Whose names?" "The brown hens. Margaret, Dorothea, and Clementine." Eliza looked at Ruby. "Do you know which one is which?" Ruby opened her mouth, closed it. "They look the same," she admitted. "So Hazel named them," Eliza said, "and you collect their eggs." "Yes." "Then you each have something the other one needs," Eliza said, "and the hens don't belong to either of you. They belong to the ranch." She looked at them both with the same steadiness. "Argue about something that can actually be settled." There was a brief silence in which both girls appeared to be deciding whether this was acceptable or an outrage. Then Hazel said, "What can actually be settled?" "Most things," Eliza said, "if you approach them correctly." She went back inside and left them thinking about it. She heard them start talking again almost immediately. Lower, more deliberate, the particular register of children who have been given a new framework and are testing it. That was the second morning. The days that followed did not transform the ranch, so much as begin to reveal what the ranch was capable of being. Eliza understood this distinction. She was not performing a miracle. She was doing what needed doing, in the order it needed doing, with the materials available. The roof of the lean-to had a section where the boards had warped and winter rain got in and sat, which was going to become rot by spring if nobody addressed it. She addressed it. She found the spare boards in the barn, and she found Silas's tools, and she climbed the lean-to with the focused attention of a woman who was not afraid of heights or of doing things she'd never been shown how to do, because most things, she had learned, were learnable if you paid attention and didn't rush. Silas came back from the east pasture at midday and stopped. "What are you doing?" he said. "Fixing the roof." "I can see that. How do you know how to do that?" "I watched our neighbor, Mr. Hennessy, do it when I was 10, she said, without looking up from what she was doing. He narrated the whole thing. He said narrating helped him not make mistakes. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Is it working?" "Reasonably." She fitted a board and pressed it. "Hand me those nails." He handed them up without further comment. He stood there while she worked, not supervising, not offering corrections, just present in the way he was present for most things, quietly, without needing it to be about him. After a while, he said, "I should have done that in October." "You had other things in October." "Still." She looked down at him briefly. He was looking at the boards, not at her. There was something in his face that she had started to recognize, a particular tightening around the jaw that appeared when he encountered evidence of how far behind things had gotten while he was keeping the rest of it from collapsing. 18 months of managing alone. The animals were healthy, the fences held, the crops had come in adequately. But the edges showed. The edges always showed in a place where one person was doing the work of two. "Silas," she said. He looked up. "It's fixed now," she said. "That's the relevant thing." He nodded. He went back to work. She watched him go and then turned back to the lean-to roof, and she thought that this man carried his failures the way some men carry injuries, quietly, privately, in a way that was either admirable or would eventually wear him down, and she wasn't sure yet which one it was going to be. Inside the cabin, the kitchen garden was her first real argument with the land. The south-facing plot had potential that it was thoroughly wasting, good sun exposure, reasonable drainage, but the soil was depleted and compacted, and half the beds had been overtaken by the kind of weeds that establish themselves so completely they start to look like they belong. She dug them out. She did it over 3 mornings in the particular cold of early spring before the air had decided to warm up, while the girls ate breakfast and periodically came to watch from the doorway with their tin cups. She turned the soil and worked in the compost from the pile behind the barn that Silas had been adding to without a clear plan for using, and she replanted in rows that had a purpose to them. Ruby came out on the 3rd morning and crouched beside her. "Why are you putting those ones so far apart?" she asked, pointing at the onion sets. "They need room for the bulb to grow underground," Eliza said. "You're only seeing the top part. The important part's invisible." Ruby considered this. Does that happen a lot? Important things being invisible? "More often than not," Eliza said. Ruby sat back on her heels and looked at the row of onion sets with the expression of a child who had been given information she suspected was about more than onions. "Papa doesn't talk much," she said after a moment. "I've noticed." "He used to talk more," Ruby said. "Before Mama." She picked up a small clod of dirt and turned it over. "Hazel thinks he's sad. I think he's just like a house where all the curtains are closed. Everything's still in there. He just closed the curtains." Eliza stopped digging. She looked at Ruby. This 6-year-old with her mother's eyes, probably, or her father's, she had no way of knowing yet, and she thought that this child was going to be formidable someday, was already in her way. "What do you think opens them?" Eliza said. Ruby shrugged with a child's practical fatalism. "Time, maybe, or someone who knows how to open curtains." She got up and went back inside to finish her breakfast, and Eliza turned back to the garden and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. The problem with Silver Hollow was not that it was cruel. Cruelty would have been easier to dismiss. The problem was that it was specific, the way small towns are specific. Everyone knew the details of everything, and the details accreted meaning they had no business having. Eliza Rowan was the woman Chester Puett had rejected at the train station, and that was her name now in Silver Hollow, more definitively than Eliza Rowan. She knew this because she saw it operate in real time the first time she went to town for supplies, 6 days after arriving at the ranch. She went alone. Silas offered to come, and she said no, she needed to learn where things were. Which was true, but also she needed to do this without someone next to her to absorb the social weight of it. She needed to do it herself and be on the other side of it. The mercantile was run by a man named Gerald Fitch, who was professionally neutral in the way of people who serve everyone in a small town and can't afford enemies. He greeted her without excessive curiosity and helped her find what she needed and added it up honestly. That was fine. The problem was the two women by the fabric counter who stopped their conversation when Eliza walked in and resumed it at a slightly different frequency. The kind of conversation that isn't quite quiet enough, that's calibrated to be overheard without being quite attributable. "She moved right out there," one of them said, to the bolts of calico. "Well, she had nowhere else to go," the other said. "What else is she going to do?" "I just think I don't know. He's a widower and she's a single woman and they're living out there together and the girls are right there, and it just seems, said the first one, which was a word that somehow contained an entire verdict. Eliza put her list on the counter and didn't turn around. She was aware of her own breathing, the deliberate evenness of it. She thought about her mother at the stove saying, "We have what we have." She thought about what it would cost to turn and address this versus what it would cost to let it sit. She made the calculation quickly. She turned around. The two women looked at her. They had the particular expression of people who had not quite believed they were audible and are now recalibrating. "I beg your pardon," Eliza said. She said it pleasantly. She said it the way her mother said difficult things, like she was simply clarifying, not confronting. "I'm Eliza Rowan. I work for Silas Boone, taking care of his daughters and managing the household. If you have questions about that arrangement, I'm happy to answer them." She paused one beat. "And if you don't, I'd appreciate it if speculation about it was kept a bit more private." She turned back to the counter. Gerald Fitch was looking at his accounts ledger with the focused attention of a man who has heard nothing and seen nothing and will continue to hear and see nothing for the foreseeable future. Behind her, there was a silence of the kind that means the people in it are revising their opinion of the situation, though not necessarily in the direction of agreement. That was all right. She wasn't asking for agreement. She carried her supplies out to the wagon and drove back to the ranch, and she didn't speak about it to anyone. But the town spoke about it. Of course it did. And the story that circulated was not the cruel one she might have feared. The rejected woman, the charity case, the housekeeper of ambiguous status. The story that circulated, slowly and with some resistance from the Fitch counter women, was a different one. The woman who had been publicly humiliated and had simply gotten up and gone to work, and who apparently was not interested in anyone's pity or gossip, and who had been seen fixing the lean-to roof herself, which was apparently a detail that stuck. Eliza didn't know this. She was too busy. The kitchen garden was coming in. The curtains in the main room she had replaced with ones she made herself from a length of blue wool she found in the bottom of a trunk, which had probably been bought for some other purpose, but it was good fabric, and it had been folded there long enough. She had to ask Silas if it was all right to use it, and asking had cost her more than she'd expected it to, because she was not accustomed to needing permission for small things. He looked at the fabric. He was quiet for a moment. "That was Margaret's," he said. "She bought it in Laramie. She was going to make something from it, and never got to it." Eliza held this fabric and waited. "Go ahead," he said. And then he walked out, because he was a man who walked out when things got close to the edge of what he could manage, and she had learned this about him in the first week and tried not to take it personally. She made the curtains anyway. They went up on a Thursday morning and changed the whole character of the room, which was what she had thought they would do, and when Hazel came downstairs and saw them, she stood very still for a long moment in the way she did when she was absorbing something rather than reacting to it. "Blue," Hazel said. "Blue," Eliza confirmed. "Mama was going to make me a blue dress," Hazel said. "From fabric she got in Laramie." Eliza did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know that." Hazel looked at the curtains for another long beat. "It's nice," she said finally. "The curtains are nice." And she sat down for breakfast with the particular containment of a child who is carrying something she doesn't quite know how to put down. That evening, Silas looked at the curtains for a long time from the doorway, standing there in the threshold between the outside and inside the way he sometimes stood when he was making a decision that looked like stillness. Eliza was at the table mending a tear in Ruby's coat, and she didn't look up because she had learned that looking up at these moments was the wrong instinct. He said, "She would have liked what you did with them." Eliza kept her eyes on the coat. "They're warm and they block the draft," she said. "Yes," he said, and went to bed. The cold, When it came seriously in the third week of her being there, came without announcement the way cold always does in Wyoming. You go to sleep in something that is merely chilly, and you wake up in something that has decided to be winter. Eliza had grown up in cold, but not this kind of cold. Pennsylvania had winters with character. Wyoming had winters with intent. Winters that were not interested in character and simply wanted everything to stop. The first real cold morning, she was up before anyone. She had the fire going before the girls woke, and she was already boiling water and doing mental inventory of the pantry when Silas came down and looked at the fire and then at her. "You're used to this?" he said. "No," she said. "But I'm here, so I'm dealing with it." He went outside to check the animals and was gone for over an hour, and came back looking like a man who had been having an argument with the weather and only partially won. He stamped his boots at the door and stood close to the fire and said, without preamble, "The east pasture fence is down, 3 sections. Cattle? Still in, for now." He was calculating something in his face. "I need to fix it today, or they'll drift." "Can you do it alone?" "I'll have to." "I can come," she said. He looked at her. "The girls can stay in," she said. "Ruby can manage the fire and Hazel can—" "You know how to fix fence?" "I know how to hold things while someone else fixes them," she said. "That's faster than doing it alone." He wanted to say no. She could see it. It wasn't that he thought she was incapable. She suspected he had revised that opinion early. It was that accepting help required acknowledging he needed it, and he was still practicing the art of that. "Get your coat," he said. They were out there for 4 hours. The cold was physical in a way that required respect. Not fear, but the particular awareness that you were contending with something that had no interest in whether you succeeded or failed. Eliza held boards and handed tools, and once, when Silas was working on the 3rd section and his hands were stiff enough to be unreliable, she took the hammer without being asked and drove the last 4 nails herself while he held the post. He didn't comment on this. She didn't need him to. On the way back, walking close enough to share some warmth, he said, "I owe you for today." "You pay me wages," she said. "You don't owe me anything." "The wages are for the girls and the house." "The ranch is the house," she said. "If the fence fails, the cattle drift, there's no income, there's no ranch. It's connected." She looked at him. "I'm not interested in a narrow job description." He looked at her for the first time on that walk, directly, like he was checking to make sure she meant it. Then he looked forward again, and they walked. "Why?" he said, after a moment. Not confrontationally, just asking. She thought about how to answer that. "Because I told you at the beginning I don't do things by halves," she said. "And because I live here now. Whatever that means, I live here. I don't know how to be somewhere and not actually be there." He was quiet for the rest of the walk, and she didn't feel it. Inside, Ruby had kept the fire exactly as instructed, and Hazel had made something she called soup, which was water with a potato and some salt in it, and very good intentions. They ate it for dinner. Everyone said it was good. Hazel knew it was not good, but she accepted the verdict with the dignity of someone who will do better next time. The weeks accumulated. Eliza wrote to Clara, not the letter she had first imagined, the one that would describe a simple new beginning with a man who valued character, but a truer one, harder to write, because she didn't know yet what she was describing. "I am on a ranch east of Silver Hollow," she wrote. "The man who hired me is not what I expected, by which I mean he is better and more difficult. And I can't explain that better in a letter. His daughters are extraordinary. The cold here is serious. I am well." She sealed it and sent it, and then spent an afternoon wondering if "I am well" was accurate, decided it was, and went back to work. The town's perception of her shifted in increments. It shifted when she began selling bread. Not because she intended to build a business, but because she baked more than the household could consume, and waste was not something she practiced. So she brought the extra to Gerald Fitch on supply runs, and he put it on the counter, and it sold before noon. The bread was not special bread. It was bread made by someone who baked with attention and used good technique, and that turned out to be rarer than it had any right to be in Silver Hollow. Fitch asked if she'd bring more. She did. The money was modest, and she gave most of it to Silas because it was his flour and his oven and his firewood. He looked at the bills she put on the table and looked at her. "Keep it," he said. "It came from your supplies." "Keep it," he said again, and left the table, and she picked up the bills and put them in the small tin she kept on the windowsill, and did not argue. The day the Hendersons' older boy came out to the ranch to ask if she could teach him to read was not a day she had planned for. He was 14, large for his age, had missed years of schooling that Silver Hollow's intermittent schoolmaster had not covered, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands and asked in the particular combination of embarrassment and desperation that appears in teenagers when they have overcome pride enough to ask for something they badly need. Eliza looked at him. She said, "Come back Thursday at 4. Silas, who had been nearby mending tack, said nothing until the Henderson boy was gone. "You're teaching now?" "He needs to read," she said. "You have enough to do." "I have Thursday at 4, she said. He looked like he wanted to say something else and didn't know what it was, so he went back to the tack. The Henderson boy came back Thursday. Hazel sat in on the lesson, ostensibly to practice her own reading, actually to establish ownership of the educational proceedings occurring in her house. Ruby sat on the other side and made occasional corrections that were mostly accurate, which the Henderson boy bore with patient humiliation. By the second lesson, he was reading simple sentences. By the fourth, he had told 2 other boys from town. Eliza's Thursday afternoons became something the ranch was known for, and she hadn't planned that either, but it had happened in the way that things happen when you simply do what's in front of you without waiting for permission. Silver Hollow had started watching the Boone Ranch with a different quality of attention, and Eliza could feel the shift without being able to point to the specific moment it occurred. The pity had not quite left, but it was being overlaid by something more useful, a kind of recalibration. The rejected woman had not retreated. She had not made herself small. She had arrived in a broken-down place and started making it functional through the simple, relentless application of competence. And competence, it turned out, was harder to dismiss than beauty. Chester Puit had not spoken to her. She saw him once, at a distance, at the edge of the market, and he saw her and looked away, and she felt absolutely nothing about this, which was perhaps the most honest measure of how much she had moved. She was mending a harness strap by lamplight one evening when Silas came in from the barn later than usual. She could tell something had happened by the way he moved. The particular economy of a man containing something rather than carrying it normally. He sat across from her without taking off his coat. "Lost a calf today," he said. "I know, Ruby told me. I should have seen it coming. The mother was off her feed for 2 days and I was focused on the north pasture and I didn't—" He stopped. He pressed his hands flat on the table. "You're one person," she said. "I've been one person for 18 months. I know what I can and can't manage." "Do you?" she said. Not unkindly, just asking. He looked at her. She held the harness strap and looked back. "You're not a one-person operation," she said. "You never were. This ranch was built for 2. You've been holding it with one hand for a year and a half, and it's been holding because you're capable, but capable doesn't mean unlimited. A calf died. You're going to lose things if you can't watch everything at once. That's not your failure. That's arithmetic." Something passed across his face. Not relief, not acceptance, something less resolved than either. He was quiet for a long time. "She managed everything," he said. "Margaret. She had a way of knowing where to be." He turned his hands over on the table, looking at them. "I've never figured out how she knew." "She probably didn't always," Eliza said. "She probably missed things too. You just forgot those because the rest of it was there." He thought about this. "Maybe. You remember what she managed because it kept working. You don't remember what she worried about in the night." He looked at her with a directness she hadn't quite seen from him before, as if something in that sentence had landed differently than expected. "How do you know she worried in the night?" "Because anyone who managed what you're describing worried in the night," Eliza said simply. "That's what managing looks like from the inside." The fire settled and popped between them. Hazel called out from the bedroom for something. Water, probably. And Eliza set down the harness strap and went to get it, and by the time she came back, Silas had gone to bed. But the harness strap was finished. He had picked it up and mended the last section while she was gone. She looked at it for a moment. Then she put out the lamp and went to her small room with the east-facing window, and she lay on the cot and she listened to the Wyoming night doing what Wyoming nights do. Nothing quietly, at great scale. And she thought about what she had told him. That's what managing looks like from the inside. She wondered if she had said it for him or for herself. Maybe both. There was no way to say that kind of thing without it also being a statement about your own experience. And her own experience was that managing looked like this. The daily maintenance of function in conditions that were not always cooperating, the small repairs and the cold mornings, and the harness straps, and the onion sets planted far enough apart for the underground parts to have room. It looked like bread that sold before noon, and curtains made from someone else's fabric, and a 6-year-old who talked about curtains with closed eyes. She had been in Silver Hollow for 6 weeks. She had arrived with $11 and a sewing kit and a broken plan. What she had now was harder to count, not more dramatic, but more solid. She had the girl's trust, which had arrived in increments. Hazel's hand in hers the first evening, Ruby's questions that were really something else, the way they fought about the chickens with her as a reference point now, the way they had started saying, "Ask Eliza when things were unclear." She had the bread money in the tin. She had her name starting to mean something in Silver Hollow that was not related to Chester Puit. She had not resolved anything. Nothing was finished. The ranch was better but not recovered. The cold was serious and the hard months were still ahead. She was sleeping on a borrowed cot in a room that wasn't hers in a life she hadn't planned for. But she lay there in the Wyoming dark and she thought, I did not come here to find what I expected. I came here and I found what was already here and I started working with it. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. The morning came cold and early, the way Wyoming mornings did, insisting on themselves before you were finished deciding whether you were ready. Eliza was up before it was fully light. She started the fire. She listened to the cabin make its small sounds around her. The wood settling, the girls beginning to stir, the distant morning sounds of the barn where Silas was already working. Ruby appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, hair standing entirely on end, carrying a boot. The buckle broke, she said. Come here, Eliza said. Let me look at it. Ruby came down and stood beside her at the fire, leaning against her with the unself-conscious ease of a child who has decided that this is where she stands, and Eliza examined the buckle and thought about what she needed to fix it, and the morning began. The buckle took her 10 minutes and a piece of wire from the small tin she kept for exactly these repairs. And Ruby watched the whole process with the focused attention she gave to anything mechanical. Not bored, not impatient, but studying, storing it for later use. By the time Hazel came downstairs, the boot was fixed and the oatmeal was on, and the morning was operating the way mornings at the Boone Ranch had started to operate, with function, if not always with grace. Spring arrived the way it does in Wyoming. Not gently, not as a reward for surviving winter, but as a different kind of argument. The cold released its grip in stages, grudgingly, and the mud that replaced the frozen ground was its own particular problem. The kitchen garden, which had been dormant under a thin crust of snow, began showing green at the edges of the beds, and Eliza spent an hour each morning assessing what had survived and what needed replanting. More had survived than she expected. The onion sets had held. The root vegetables were intact. The herbs she had tucked against the south wall of the cabin had come through with only minor casualties. She stood in the garden on a Tuesday morning in late March, with mud on her boots and her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she thought, this is working. Not finished, not transformed, but working in the way that slow things work, without announcement, through accumulated small decisions that compound over time until you look up one day and the situation is materially different from how it was. Silver Hollow noticed before she did. That was how it happened. Fitch at the Mercantile mentioned it to her on a supply run in early April. He had a way of delivering information sideways, working up to it while he tallied figures. People been asking, he said, without looking up from his ledger. About what? The bread first. Then I told Mrs. Hanover you'd helped her boy with his reading. Then she told 2 other people. He made a mark in the ledger. You know how it goes. She knew how it went. She had lived long enough in small communities to understand that reputation moved like water. Slowly at first, finding its level, and then faster once it found a channel. There's talk of starting a proper school, Fitch said. Not a serious school, not yet. But some of the families have been saying someone ought to organize the children's learning instead of waiting on the county to send another schoolmaster who stays 3 months and leaves. He looked up briefly. Your name came up. I'm not a teacher, she said. You've been teaching Henderson's boy every Thursday for 2 months. That's different. Is it? She paid for her supplies and didn't answer. She drove back to the ranch and thought about it the whole 3 hours. Not because she was tempted so much as because the conversation had clarified something she had been circling without naming. She had built something here. Not what she'd planned, not what she'd packed herself up for in Pennsylvania, but something. And Silver Hollow was beginning to see the shape of it before she had decided what to do with that. She told Silas about it that evening, matter-of-factly, the way she reported anything relevant. He was at the table going over what passed for the ranch's financial ledger, handwritten columns of figures in a book that was doing its best to track the economics of a hard year. He listened. He said, "What do you think?" "I think I have enough to do." "You do," he agreed. She looked at him. "But?" He set down the pencil. "But you've been doing more than enough since the first week. Adding to it doesn't seem to slow you down." She looked at the ledger, the columns. She said, "How bad is it?" He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him considering whether to answer, which told her it was bad enough that honesty required the decision to be deliberate. "Bad enough," he said. "The cattle?" "Prices are down, have been all winter. I've got a good number of healthy animals and not enough buyers." He turned the pencil end over end. "The breeding stock is solid. If prices recover by fall, I'll come out. If they don't..." He didn't finish that. "If they don't?" "I'll have decisions to make," he said. She looked at the figures upside down across the table and thought about what decisions looked like in the context of a ranch. Which animals to sell at a loss, what to stop maintaining, where the line was between a bad year and a year that compounded into something permanent. "Could you sell the bread?" she said. He looked up. "Not through Fitch, directly." She was thinking as she spoke, organizing it the way she organized the garden beds, working out the logic before committing to the layout. "The family's coming for the reading lessons. If I baked more and sold it directly, the margin's better than through the mercantile. You'd need more flour, more fuel. I'd need an investment, small, and I'd need to bake on Tuesdays and Thursdays instead of just when there's extra." She paused. "I think it would work." Silas looked at her. Then he looked at the ledger, then back at her. "You're proposing a business." "I'm proposing something that keeps the ranch solvent through a bad price year," she said. "You can call it what you want." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You'd need a second oven rack." "Yes. Fitch has them." "I know." He closed the ledger. "All right," he said. She baked on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The reading lessons on Thursday afternoons became a fixed point around which the morning's baking and the afternoon's teaching organized themselves, and the families who came for teaching sometimes left with bread. And the word spread the way useful things spread in communities that don't have enough of them, quickly, without needing advertising. Mrs. Hanover, whose boy had been the first to come for reading lessons, was the one who said it plainly at the small gathering of women that happened occasionally at the Callaway farm on Sunday afternoons. Eliza wasn't there, she'd been invited once and had come once and decided that she preferred her Sundays for other things. But the Henderson boy's mother reported back to her later, with the particular relish of a woman delivering good news. Mrs. Hanover said, "I don't know why we were all whispering about Eliza Rowan. She's the most useful person to come to this valley in 10 years. Eliza heard this and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite relief. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a weight she hadn't been consciously aware of carrying. She said, "That's generous," and changed the subject because she had never been comfortable with praise that arrived in a group. What she was not prepared for was Chester Puitt. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday in early May, which was deliberate. A Wednesday was not a supply day, not a lesson day, not a day when she would have reason to be in town or have visitors expected. He had chosen it carefully, which told her the visit had been thought about. She was in the garden when she heard the wagon, and she stood up and turned around and saw him coming down the track, and felt something very specific and very manageable. Not anger, not the old humiliation, but a flat, clear recognition. Of course. Silas was in the north pasture. The girls were inside. Eliza brushed the dirt from her hands and walked to the fence and waited. Chester Puitt looked better than he had at the train station, or at least more carefully assembled. He was wearing a good coat and his hat was brushed. He had the appearance of a man who had prepared for something. He stopped the wagon 20 feet out and got down from it with the careful movements of someone who is uncertain of his reception. He said, "Miss Rowan." "Mr. Puitt." He looked at the garden. He looked at the cabin. He looked at her in the particular way of a man who is comparing what he is seeing now to what he had dismissed before and discovering the arithmetic doesn't work out the way he'd calculated. "I heard you've been doing well," he said. "I've been working," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it usually leads to the same place." He nodded. He had his hat in his hands. He'd taken it off without seeming to realize he had. "I behaved badly," he said. "At the station." She looked at him and said nothing. I had an expectation," he said, "and when it wasn't met, I reacted badly, publicly." He stopped, started again. "I've thought about it." "I imagine you have," she said. "I'd like to make it right," he said. She kept her voice even. "In what way?" He looked at the hat in his hands, then at her. "I have a larger spread than Boone, better situated. The house is bigger. I've been doing well this past year, and I could offer—" He stopped when he saw her expression, which had not changed but had become something he apparently correctly identified as requiring him to stop. "You're offering me a better position," she said. "I'm offering you what I should have offered in the first place," he said, with the particular tone of a man who believes that recognizing a mistake and making a corrective gesture are essentially equivalent to having not made the mistake. She looked at the cabin behind her, the blue curtains in the window, the kitchen garden in its ordered rows. She looked at the lean-to roof she had fixed in October. She thought about Hazel's hand in hers. She thought about Ruby at the fire, boot in hand. She thought about Silas at the table, ledger open, saying bad enough with the honesty of a man who had decided she deserved the truth. She thought about what Chester Puit was offering and what he was not. "Mr. Puit," she said, "you're offering me a house, a larger one, better situated. I understand that." "Yes," he said. "What you don't understand," she said, "is that I already have something that a larger house can't improve." She said it without heat, without triumph. She said it the way she said most things, as a plain statement of what was true. "You're describing comfort. I'm not interested in comfort as a primary consideration. I've never been interested in comfort as a primary consideration. That's part of why you rejected me at the station, I imagine, because I didn't look like someone's idea of comfort." Something moved across his face. He had not expected this angle. "I've built something here," she said. "Not what I planned. Something I didn't know to plan for. And it is worth more to me than the correction of your original error." She looked at him steadily. "I don't say this to humiliate you. I say it because it's true, and because you came out here for an honest answer, and I'm giving you one." Chester Puit stood in the track with his hat in his hands and looked at the Boone Ranch, the repaired fence, the garden, the curtains in the window. And she saw on his face the specific expression of a man who understands. He miscalculated something significant and cannot find the version of himself that knows how to respond to that. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on. He said, "He's a lucky man." "He's a capable man who's had a difficult 18 months, she said. "Luck is something else." She looked at him without unkindness. "Go home, Mr. Puit. Do better than you did at the station." He got back in the wagon. He drove away without looking back, which she respected more than if he had. She stood there for a moment after the wagon disappeared. She realized her hands had gone still at her sides, completely still, the way they only did when she was absolutely certain about something. She thought about what she had said, and she tested each sentence of it against what was actually true, and she found that every sentence held. She went back to the garden. Silas came in from the north pasture at midday and found her making lunch, and he looked at her with the particular attentiveness he had when something had happened in his absence. "Chester Puit was here," she said, before he could ask. He set his gloves on the table. He waited. "He came to offer me a position at his ranch," she said. "Larger house, better situated." She said it flatly, giving him the information the way she gave him any relevant information. "I told him no." Silas was quiet for a long moment. "Why?" She looked up from the bread she was slicing. "Why what?" "Why did you say no?" She held his gaze. "Because I'm not interested in what he's offering." He looked at her with the directness he sometimes produced when he had decided to look at something rather than sideways at it. "You could have a better situation than this one." "I have the situation I have," she said. "I'm not looking to trade up." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name quickly. It happened fast, and then it was gone, replaced by his usual steadiness. He said, "All right," and picked up his gloves and went to wash his hands, and she finished slicing the bread and called the girls in for lunch. But something had shifted. She felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the weather actually changes, a difference in pressure, in the quality of the air. He was the same at lunch, the same at dinner, the same with the girls, helping Ruby trace letters after the meal the way he had started doing in the evenings, a habit that had developed so gradually she hadn't noticed it becoming a habit. He was exactly the same, and yet. She noticed that evening that he had mended the loose step on the cabin porch. She had mentioned the step 3 weeks ago, once, in passing, as one of the minor things on the long list of minor things. He had done it without telling her. It was done well, solid, the kind of repair that would hold. She stood on the porch in the dark and put her weight on the step. It held. The Henderson boy, his name was Thomas, she had started using his name, was reading at a level that made him useful now, which was the real measure of reading, she had always thought. Reading that stays abstract is an accomplishment. Reading that changes what a person can do is something else. Thomas Henderson was 16 by spring, and he was reading the ranch accounts for his father, reading the seed catalogs, reading the legal documents that a small ranching family accumulated and often couldn't properly interpret. His father had come to the ranch in April to shake Eliza's hand, and she had shaken it and told him Thomas did the work himself, which was true. The other children she taught were younger, 7, 8, 9, and they learned differently from Thomas, with more chaos and more joy and a constant competitive awareness of each other's progress. She ran the Thursday lessons with the kind of ordered flexibility she applied to the garden, a structure that could accommodate what actually grew in it, not just what she had planned for. Word of the lessons reached the ear of a woman named Mrs. Pryor, who lived on the far west side of the valley, and whose opinion of things carried weight in Silver Hollow, for reasons that Eliza had not yet fully mapped, but that everyone seemed to understand instinctively. Mrs. Pryor came to the ranch one morning, not on a Thursday, not announced, and sat in the kitchen and drank tea and watched Eliza work and ask questions with the efficiency of a woman who has decided to gather information directly rather than through intermediate sources. "How long do you plan to stay?" Mrs. Pryor asked. "I haven't put a limit on it," Eliza said. "You came here planning to marry Chester Puitt." "I came here planning to build something," Eliza said. "The specifics of what that would look like have changed." Mrs. Pryor sipped her tea. She was a woman in her 60s, with the posture of someone who had decided decades ago that slumping was a form of capitulation. "Chester Puitt has been telling people he made a mistake," she said. "I know." "He tells it as though the mistake was rejecting you," Mrs. Pryor said, "as though the narrative is about him recognizing your value." "That's his version," Eliza said. "What's yours?" Eliza looked at this woman who had come to her kitchen without being invited and was asking direct questions and expected direct answers. She respected this. "My version," she said, "is that it doesn't matter anymore. Chester Puitt is not a significant part of my story." Mrs. Pryor set down her cup. "You know what Silver Hollow needed?" "I imagine you're going to tell me." "One who didn't need anything from us," Mrs. Pryor said. "Everyone who comes to this valley needs something. Land, water rights, a husband, a start. They arrive wanting something from the community, and the community has to decide whether to give it. You arrived needing something and then stopped needing it so fast that by the time anyone had decided whether to help you, you were already helping them." She looked at Eliza with the assessment of a woman who has watched a great many people come through a frontier valley and learned to read them. "That's unusual." "I still need things," Eliza said. "I just don't wait for people to provide them." Mrs. Pryor smiled. Brief, real. "That," she said, "is the entire difference." What came next came from a direction Eliza had not anticipated, because she had been watching the obvious threats and not the one that came quietly, from the side. It was Ruby who noticed first. It was always Ruby who noticed things first, because Ruby watched the world with the systematic attention of someone who suspects it is full of information she hasn't accessed yet. "Papa isn't sleeping," Ruby said one morning, with the matter-of-fact delivery of a child reporting a weather condition. "What do you mean?" "I hear him," Ruby said. "At night, moving around." Eliza said nothing, but she started paying attention. She had been aware of Silas's difficulty with the finances, the ledger she'd seen, the conversation about prices. She knew the shape of the worry even if she didn't have all the figures. But the nights? She had not been tracking the nights. She started tracking the nights. He was up at 2, sometimes at 3. She heard the cabin creak under his weight, the small sounds of a man trying to be quiet and not entirely succeeding. Once she heard him on the porch, just standing there, no particular movement, for the better part of an hour. She didn't go out. It wasn't the right thing, not yet. But she began the next morning's breakfast earlier than usual, so that when he came in, things were ready, and she said nothing about the night except that she had made extra coffee. He looked at the coffee. He sat down. He drank it. On a Thursday morning in late May, Thomas Henderson arrived early. Not for a lesson, his day was Wednesday now. She had shifted him to make room for the younger children. And he had a look on his face that was the particular combination of urgency and discomfort that appeared when someone had information they didn't know what to do with. "There's talk in town," he said. He was addressing Eliza, not Silas, because he had made the assessment that she was the person to tell. "About what?" "About the Brennan brothers." He looked at his hands. "They've been buying up water rights, east of town. My father says they've been doing it quiet, small parcels, but it adds up." Eliza was still. "How far east?" Thomas looked at her. "Past the Henderson spread," he said, "toward the Boone property line." She kept her voice level. "Has anyone talked to Silas about this?" "I don't think anyone knew to talk to him," Thomas said. "My father only figured it out when he looked at the county records. The transfers are spread out, different names, but the money's all coming from the Brennans." She looked at Thomas for a moment. He was 16 and steady, and she had done right by him, and he was doing right by her now, and she recognized this clearly. "Thank you," she said. "You did the right thing coming here." He nodded and left, and she went to find Silas. He was in the barn. She told him directly. No approach, no softening, what Thomas had said. She watched his face go through the sequence. Attention, calculation, something harder. He said, "The water rights to the creek tributary? That's what it sounds like. If they control the tributary, your east pasture doesn't get summer water," she finished. He leaned against the stall wall. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas's father didn't say. Long enough to have accumulated. Silas was quiet for a moment. "The Brennans have money. They've been sitting on it for years, waiting for the right moment to start expanding." He looked at her. "This is that moment." She thought about the ledger, the cattle prices, the sleepless nights. She thought about what a water rights dispute cost to fight and what it cost to lose. "What's your documentation?" she said. "What?" "Your water rights. Your original deed. The creek access." She kept her eyes on him. "What do you have, and where is it?" He pushed off the wall. "There's a deed box in the cabin." "Then that's where we start," she said. "Show me what you have." They spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with the deed box open between them, going through papers that Silas had not looked at in years. Some of them dating from before his father had passed the ranch to him, county documents with faded ink, hand-drawn survey maps, the original water rights agreement that established the tributary access as appurtenant to the Boone property. The papers were there. The rights were documented. But documentation and protection were different things, and Eliza knew it. "You need to talk to a lawyer," she said. "Lawyers cost money. Losing the water rights costs more." He looked at the papers. He said, "Where?" "Laramie, or someone who rides circuit to Silver Hollow." She was already thinking through what she knew, which was not enough, but it was a starting point. "Mrs. Pryor would know. She knows everything about how this valley operates." "You'd ask her?" "I'd ask her," Eliza said. "Tomorrow." He looked at her with the expression she'd started to recognize, the one that appeared when she did something that reminded him he wasn't alone in this. It was a hard thing to watch, that expression, because it contained so much of what the previous 18 months must have looked like from the inside. A man reminding himself each time that there was someone else in the room. Hazel came in from outside tracking mud with the confident obliviousness of a 6-year-old and stopped when she saw the papers spread across the table. "What are those?" she said. "Documents," Silas said. "About what?" "The ranch," Eliza said. "The water." Hazel looked at the papers with a seriousness that her face was increasingly capable of. "Is something wrong with the water?" "We're making sure nothing goes wrong with it," Eliza said. Hazel appeared to accept this. Not because she was satisfied, but because she understood the sentence meant this is being handled, and she had started to trust that when things were being handled at the Boone Ranch, they were being handled properly. She went to wash her boots at the door, still tracking mud, still oblivious to the mud, and Silas watched her with an expression that was not a smile exactly, but was something in that direction, softer than his usual, something like the feeling before relief. "She trusts you," he said, quietly. Not to make a point, just saying it. "Yes," Eliza said. "So does Ruby, in her way." "I know." He looked at the papers on the table. He said, "I'm glad you didn't go back to Pennsylvania." It was the most direct thing he had said to her about anything that wasn't a practical matter, and she heard the weight of it, all the things that particular sentence was carrying that he hadn't found words for. She thought about the eastbound train schedule on the wall of the Silver Hollow station. She thought about the $11. She thought about walking down the platform with her chin level and her boot catching the gap in the boards. "I'm not a person who leaves when it gets difficult," she said. "I know that now," he said. She began stacking the papers back into the deed box, organizing them in a sequence that made sense, chronological, with the water rights documentation on top. She worked carefully, deliberately, the way she worked at most things. Outside, Ruby had found Hazel at the door, and an argument was developing about the mud, specifically about whose fault the mud was, which was a question with no satisfying answer because the mud belonged to Wyoming, and they both knew it. Eliza listened to their voices overlapping, familiar, and real, and she put the last paper in the deed box and closed it, and she thought, this is a fight worth having. The water rights, the Brennans, the documents in the box. All of it. She thought about what Mrs. Pryor had said. You arrived needing something and then stopped needing it so fast. And she thought that wasn't quite right. She still needed things. She needed the tributary water to stay where it belonged. She needed the price of cattle to recover. She needed Silas Boone to sleep through the night. She needed things. She was just learning how to fight for them in a place that wasn't hers by birth, but was becoming hers by choice, one fixed step and one planted row at a time. And she was not finished yet, not remotely, but she knew the shape of the fight now, and she was not afraid of it. The deed box sat on the table between them, and outside the Wyoming evening was coming in slow and gold, and the girls were still arguing about the mud, and Eliza thought, tomorrow, Mrs. Pryor. And then the lawyer, and then whatever comes after that, one thing at a time. That was how you held a ranch. That was how you held anything that mattered. Mrs. Pryor did not waste time once she understood the situation. Eliza rode to the Pryor farm the next morning before the dew was off the grass, and she sat at Mrs. Pryor's kitchen table and laid out what Thomas Henderson had told them about the Brennan brothers' water rights acquisitions, the way she laid out most things, directly, without embellishment, letting the facts carry the weight they already had without additional drama. Mrs. Pryor listened with her hands folded on the table, and when Eliza finished, she was quiet for exactly the time it took to think through what she'd heard. Edmund Voss, she said. Who is he? He practices out of Laramie, but he rides circuit to Silver Hollow the second Tuesday of every month. He's thorough and he's not crooked, which narrows the field considerably. She looked at Eliza. The second Tuesday is in 9 days. That may not be enough time. No, Mrs. Pryor agreed, but it's what there is. In the meantime, Silas needs to file a notice of use with the county clerk. It won't stop anything, but it creates a dated record of active claim. The Brennans will be doing the same thing, and the question of who filed what when is going to matter if this goes before a judge. Eliza stored this. Is there a chance it doesn't go before a judge? There's always a chance, Mrs. Pryor said. But the Brennans don't start things they expect to negotiate. They start things they expect to win. She looked at Eliza steadily. This is going to cost Silas money he probably doesn't have. I know. And you're here anyway. I live here, Eliza said. The water belongs to the ranch. If the ranch loses the water, everything I've built here with it goes too. She said it plainly, without making it about sentiment. It was practical, and she stated it as practical, and Mrs. Pryor received it that way. File the notice today, Mrs. Pryor said. I'll send word to Voss that he needs to come prepared for a water rights consultation. Eliza stood. Thank you. Don't thank me. Thank me when it's resolved. She walked Eliza to the door and said, as Eliza was leaving, You know what I've noticed about you, Miss Rowan? Eliza turned. You never ask whether something can be done, Mrs. Pryor said. You ask what needs to be done first. She held the door. That's not common. Eliza rode back to the ranch and found Silas in the barn and told him everything. He listened the way he listened to all important things, without interrupting, without reacting until he'd heard it all. Then he said, County clerk's office is in town. I'd have to go today to make it back before dark. I know, she said. I'll stay with the girls. He looked at her. There was something in it she didn't examine too carefully. What would I have done, he said, if Thomas Henderson hadn't told you? You would have found out another way, she said. Eventually. Eventually, he repeated, and said it with the particular flatness of a man who understands that eventually, in certain situations, is another word for too late. He went to town. I was back before dark with the filed notice and a handshake from the clerk and a look on his face that was not yet relieved but was at least oriented, facing the right direction. The 9 days before Voss arrived were not quiet days. The Brennan brothers were two men named Cal and Roy who had ranched west of Silver Hollow for 15 years with the patient accumulation of people who plan over a long horizon. They were not violent men. They were, in some ways, more dangerous than violent men because they operated entirely within legal frameworks and had spent years learning exactly how much those frameworks could be bent before they became something else. They came to the Boone Ranch on the 4th day. Eliza was the one who saw them coming. Silas was in the east pasture. She walked to the fence and stood at it and watched the two men approach, and she assessed them the way she assessed most things, without the distortion of either fear or contempt, just clearly. Cal Brennan was the older, the broader, the one who spoke. Roy Brennan stood slightly behind and to the left, and his function, Eliza understood immediately, was to watch and to remember. He had the still, attentive quality of a man who cataloged things. Mr. Boone around? Cal said from the other side of the fence. He's working, she said. Is there something I can help with? Cal looked at her with the particular assessment of a man who has decided the woman at the fence is not the relevant party and is running the calculation of whether it's worth being dismissive or whether it's faster to say something brief and wait for someone more useful. We'll wait, he said. He'll be a while, she said. You're welcome to leave word. Cal looked at her again, longer this time, revising. You're the Rowan woman, he said. The one who came out from... I'm Eliza Rowan, she said. I manage the Boone household. If you have business with the ranch, I'm an appropriate person to speak with. Roy Brennan, who had not spoken yet, made a small adjustment in his posture that might have been amusement. Cal said, We've been acquiring some water access east of here. I wanted to speak with Boone about an arrangement. The tributary that runs through his east pasture is appurtenant to this property, Eliza said, and has been since the original deed. I presume you know that since it's in the county records. Cal's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just the small recalibration of a man who has met a fence where he expected open ground. The records show what they show, he said, but there are other considerations. There usually are, she said. Mr. Boone has retained legal counsel. Any formal discussion of water access arrangements will need to go through him. She held Cal Brennan's gaze with the steadiness she had developed over months of holding things steadily. I'll tell Mr. Boone you came by. Cal looked at her for one more long moment. Then he said, You do that, and turned his horse, and Roy Brennan turned with him, and they rode back the way they came. Roy Brennan glanced back once, and she saw in his face not hostility, but the particular attention of a man reassessing his information. She stayed at the fence until they were out of sight. When Silas came in that evening, she told him what had happened in the same order it had happened, detail by detail. He sat at the table and listened, and when she finished, he said, You told them we had a lawyer. I told them you had retained legal counsel, she said. Voss hasn't agreed to take the case yet. He will, she said. And more importantly, the Brennans don't know the timing. All they know is that they came here expecting a man alone with a financial problem, and instead they found someone who knew the word appurtenant and mentioned legal counsel without blinking. He looked at her for a moment. That bought us time. A little, she said. Don't waste it. He didn't. He spent the next 4 days going through every piece of documentation in the deed box with the focused attention of a man who has decided that understanding is not optional. He asked Eliza to go through it with him, and she did, and they sat at the kitchen table in the evenings after the girls were in bed and worked through the survey maps and the dated agreements and the chain of title on the water rights, and she learned the shape of the legal problem alongside him, neither of them pretending to know more than they did. Hazel and Ruby were aware something was happening. Children always are. They moved through the cabin with the particular slightly careful behavior of children who have taken a reading of the adult atmosphere and decided to reduce their footprint. Hazel organized things more quietly than usual. Ruby asked fewer questions, which was a more reliable indicator of tension than anything Hazel did. On the second evening of this, Ruby came and sat beside Eliza at the table and looked at the papers without touching them. "Are we going to lose the water?" she said. Silas looked up. Eliza looked at Ruby. "We're making sure we don't," Eliza said. "But we might?" "Lots of things might happen," Eliza said. "We work on making the right ones more likely." Ruby thought about this. "What can I do?" "You can let us work," Silas said. Not harshly, just directly, the way he spoke to his daughters when he was being honest with them rather than managing them. Ruby accepted this and went to bed. They heard her and Hazel talking in low voices in their room for a while. The specific murmur of two people processing something they don't entirely understand but understand is serious. Silas looked at the closed door of the girls' room. He said, "I don't want them afraid." "They're not afraid," Eliza said. "They're watching how it's handled." She looked at him. "That's different." Edmund Voss arrived on the second Tuesday as promised. He was a smaller man than she'd expected from Mrs. Pryor's description. Compact, precise, with the quality of someone who carried a great deal of information in an organized interior and accessed it efficiently. He sat at the Boone table and reviewed the documentation Eliza had organized, and he asked questions in a sequence that told her he already knew most of the answers and was verifying rather than discovering. "The original water rights language is your strongest asset," Voss said. "The word appurtenant is unambiguous. The rights travel with the land, not separately." He turned a page. "The Brennans know this. What they're doing is establishing a pattern of adjacent acquisition and then arguing interference of use. Essentially that their upstream holdings affect your access in ways that require renegotiation." "Can they do that?" Silas said. "They can try," Voss said. "It's been done elsewhere in the territory. The argument requires them to demonstrate actual interference, and that's harder when the downstream owner has a clear dated record of uninterrupted use." He looked at the notice of use Silas had filed. "This helps. Who told you to file this?" "Mrs. Pryor," Eliza said. Voss made a small sound that was either appreciation or recognition. "Of course," he said. "What else do you have?" She had kept records. This was the thing. She had been keeping records since the first week. Not formally, not with any specific legal strategy in mind, but with the instinct of a woman who had grown up watching her mother keep careful accounts, because the world treated you better when you could show your work. The garden yields by date, the water used by week, the cattle moving through the east pasture and when. She had written these things in the household accounts book alongside the bread sales and the supply costs, and she produced the book now and set it on the table, and Voss looked at it and then at her. "How long have you kept this?" he said. "Since October," she said, "when I arrived." "That's 8 months of documented water use." 8 months and 4 days, she said. Voss looked at Silas. "Where did you find her?" "She came on the train," Silas said, and there was something in it that was not quite dry humor, but was adjacent to it, and Eliza looked at the table and said nothing. Voss took the case. He was direct about the cost and direct about the odds, which she respected. The cost was manageable if the bread sales continued and if the summer cattle prices recovered at least partially, which Silas said they were showing signs of doing. The odds depended on how far the Brennans were willing to push, which depended on what they thought they were going to gain. "They're not after your water for the water," Voss said on his way out. "They're after your east pasture. The tributary access is the lever. If they can create enough uncertainty about the water rights, they're betting you'll sell the pasture to resolve the dispute." "I won't," Silas said. "I know that," Voss said. "They don't yet." He put on his hat. "Let me write some letters and see if they know it better by the end of the month." After Voss left, the cabin was quiet for a while. The girls were outside. The afternoon light was coming through the blue curtains at a long angle, and the dust that always existed in a working ranch house was visible in it, drifting, which Eliza usually found irritating and today did not. Silas stood at the window. "We have a chance," he said. Not a question, just saying it out loud. "We have a good chance," she said. He turned. He was looking at her with the direct, undefended look he only produced occasionally, when the layers of management and practicality weren't quite in place. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. It is difficult for me to—" He stopped. He tried again. "When Margaret died, I made a decision that I understand now was the wrong one. I decided the best thing I could do for the girls and for the ranch was to keep everything operating, to be the functional part, to not let anything stop." He looked at his hands. "And that worked, in the sense that nothing stopped. But it cost things. Things I didn't realize I was spending until they were gone." She said nothing. She let him find it. "You came here and you did the work," he said. "That's what I told myself you were doing, just work. That's what I needed, and that's what you were providing, but that's not—" He stopped again. "That's not all that's happened." She was very still. "The curtains," he said. "The garden. The way Hazel has started laughing again, which she hadn't done properly since the way Ruby talks to you like you're a person who makes sense to her. The roof of the lean-to." He looked at her. "I fixed the step on the porch." "I noticed," she said. "I noticed you noticed," he said. "I noticed you didn't say anything about it. I thought you'd rather I didn't." "I would have," he said, "and also I wouldn't have." He moved from the window. He sat in the chair across from her at the table, the way they sat in the evenings going over documents, but this was not that. "I don't know how to say what I'm trying to say. I know how to manage a ranch, and I know how to read weather, and I know how to do most things that keeping this place alive requires. I don't know how to—" He looked directly at her. "I've been afraid of what I feel because I'm not certain you feel any version of it back. And I'm also not certain that you'd stay even if you did, because you came here because you had no other option, and that's not the same as wanting to be here." The afternoon light moved through the curtains. Somewhere outside, Ruby was telling Hazel something at considerable volume. "Silas," she said. He waited. "I turned down Chester Puett's offer," she said. "He offered me a larger house and a better situation, and I told him no. I told him I already had something worth more." She looked at him with the same directness she had offered Chester Puett, but different, warmer, more careful. "I wasn't talking about the curtains." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face moved through several things, calculation to recognition to something that was not calculation at all. "I'm not a simple man to be in proximity to," he said. "I'm told I'm closed off. I'm told I work too much and talk too little, and I know both of those things are true." You talk when you have something to say," she said. "I found that adequate." "You deserve more than adequate." "I deserve what's real," she said. "I've had plenty of adequate and not much that was real. I'd rather have real." He reached across the table. He did it the way he did most things, not tentatively, but with the measured quality of someone who has thought it through and decided. He put his hand over hers. His hands were rough and large and warm, the hands of a man who worked in all weathers, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that for a moment without any further language, because the language they had had been enough and adding to it would have been unnecessary. Ruby came in through the door and stopped when she saw them. She looked at the joined hands on the table. She looked at her father's face. She looked at Eliza's. She processed this with the focused assessment she brought to all new information. "Finally," she said, with the unsentimental satisfaction of a 6-year-old whose theory of events has been confirmed. She went to get a biscuit from the tin on the counter and went back outside, and they heard her telling Hazel something, and they heard Hazel's response, which was a sound of mixed emotions, and then nothing more, because the girls had decided to process it elsewhere. Silas looked at the door. He looked back at Eliza. He said, "She's been expecting that." "Ruby expects most things," Eliza said. "She just waits to see if she's right." "Usually is," he said. "Usually is," she agreed. What came in the weeks after was not a sudden transformation. It was more like a door that had been partially open for months, finally standing properly open, which changed the light in a room, but not the room itself. They were still who they were. He still worked too much and said too little, and she still made decisions without waiting for consensus and kept records that other people would have thought unnecessary. But they were who they were now, without the particular strain of two people trying to be only what they had agreed to be. He started sitting with her in the evenings differently, not just at the table over documents, but after. When the documents were put away and the girls were settled and the work was done as much as work at a ranch is ever done. He would sit in the chair by the fire, and she would sit at the table with her mending, and they would sometimes talk and sometimes not, and the not talking was no longer silence that needed filling. It was just the sound of a house where people lived. He told her things he had not told anyone. Not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but over the course of evenings, in pieces. He told her about Margaret, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things that required it, without trying to manage what he said or redirect it, just receiving it. He told her about the winter after Margaret died, which had been the hardest thing he had endured, harder than the work, harder than the money. Because the work and the money were problems with solutions, and grief was not a problem but a condition, and you could not solve it. You could only carry it and keep moving. You kept moving, she said. I had to, he said. The girls needed, not because of the girls, she said. You would have kept moving anyway. It's who you are. He looked at her. You think so? I think you're the kind of person who fixes the step on the porch and doesn't mention it, she said. That's someone who keeps moving. He was quiet for a moment. What kind of person does that make you? You're the kind who notices the step was fixed and doesn't mention that either. Compatible, she said. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile she had seen from him, and it was enough. The Brennan situation resolved not in the courtroom but before it, which Voss had considered likely if the letters he sent established clearly enough that the Boone water rights were well documented and actively defended, and not the soft target the Brennans had calculated. Cal Brennan came to Voss's office in Silver Hollow on a Tuesday in July. Eliza was not there, but Voss told her afterward. And he sat across from the lawyer and looked at the documentation Voss laid out, and he said, "This is going to cost more than the pasture is worth." "That's my assessment as well," Voss had said. The Brennans withdrew their adjacent acquisition strategy, which was not a withdrawal so much as a redirection. They were not men who stopped. They simply moved to different territory. But they moved away from the Boone property line, and the tributary stayed where it had always been, running through the east pasture the way water goes where water is supposed to go. When Silas came home with that news, he came in the door, and he stood there, and the girls looked up from what they were doing and read his face the way children read the faces of the people their lives depend on. "Is it done?" Eliza said. "It's done," he said. Ruby threw a tin cup in the air, caught it, and said, "I knew it." Hazel, more circumspect, put down her book and nodded with the serious satisfaction of a child who had been trusting the outcome to competent management and was gratified to be right. The summer came fully in after that, and with it the particular quality of Wyoming summer that makes the winter feel unlikely. The heat of it, the big sky, the long days that go golden at both ends with a stretch of brilliant middle. The cattle prices had recovered enough that Silas's assessment of the year shifted from making it to doing reasonably, which was a meaningful change. Eliza's bread had become, by some accumulation of reputation and habit, a fixed expectation at Fitch's Mercantile, and 3 other households that received a weekly delivery via the Henderson boy, who had expanded his reading skill to include the basic math of a delivery ledger that Eliza had set him up with. She wrote to Clara again in August. This time the letter was longer and easier to write. "Something I could not have described to you in April is clearer to me now," she wrote. "I came here because I had to, and I stayed because I found something worth staying for. I don't mean comfort. I mean the kind of thing that's hard to name, that has to do with waking up in a place and feeling that the place is yours, and you are accountable to it, and that accountability is not a burden." She paused over what to write next and then wrote, "His name is Silas. I think you would like him. He talks very little, and when he does, it means something. His daughters are going to be extraordinary people. I am not yet finished here, by which I mean I think I am just beginning." She sealed it, and on the next supply run she gave it to Fitch to put in the post. It was Hazel who asked the question that Eliza had been wondering when it would arrive. They were at the kitchen table on a Thursday afternoon, lesson time, which had become the formal structure of the week's middle, and the younger children had gone home, and it was just Hazel and Ruby and Eliza going over the addition sums that Hazel had been working through with the methodical patience she applied to things she found difficult. Ruby had already finished and was drawing something at the end of the table. Hazel put down her pencil. She looked at Eliza. "Are you going to stay?" she said. The room was quiet. Ruby stopped drawing. Eliza looked at Hazel. She thought about the various ways to answer this, the careful ways, the ways that protected everyone from commitment while things were still being decided. She thought about what Hazel was actually asking, which was not a logistical question. "Yes," she said. Hazel looked at her for a moment. She picked her pencil back up. "Good," she said. "I thought so. I just wanted to be sure." Ruby resumed drawing. What she was drawing, Eliza saw when she glanced over, was a house. Their house, approximately, with the lean-to visible on the side and something in the garden. There were 4 figures in the yard. She had drawn them without any prompting and without calling attention to it, just putting them there. 4 figures, same size, standing in front of the house. Eliza looked at the drawing for a moment and then looked away, because the afternoon light was making things unclear, and she needed to be able to see the addition sums properly. Silas came in at 5 and found them still at the table. He looked at the scene. The papers spread out, Hazel's pencil work, Ruby's drawing, Eliza sitting in the middle of it. And he stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he sometimes stood in the doorway, taking stock. "Papa," Ruby said, not looking up from the drawing. "Eliza said she's staying." He looked at Eliza. "I told Hazel yes," Eliza said, evenly. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "There's something I want to show you, after dinner." She looked at him. His face was neutral, which meant he was containing something. She had learned to read the containment. "All right," she said. After dinner, after the girls were settled, he took a lantern and led her to the north side of the cabin, to what had been, for as long as she'd been at the ranch, a storeroom. A room she used for overflow from the pantry and for the bolts of fabric and the extra tools and all the miscellaneous accumulation of a working ranch. He opened the door. It was not a storeroom. The overflow was gone, reorganized somewhere else. The walls had been properly chinked, the floor leveled and swept to a cleanliness it had probably not had since the cabin was first built. There was a window on the east wall, a real window, larger than the small one in her current room. And she understood what the east wall meant: morning light, sunrise, the direction she had oriented herself toward from the first week. There was a shelf along one wall, built level and solid. There was nothing else in the room yet because it was waiting. She stood in the doorway with the lantern's light reaching the corners. "When did you do this?" she said. "Over the last 2 months," he said. "The window took the longest." She looked at the window. She looked at the room. She understood what this was. Not an arrangement, not a practical provision of adequate employee housing, but a declaration in the only language he was fully fluent in, which was the language of things built rather than said. "I couldn't say everything I wanted to say," he said from behind her. "I couldn't find all the words, so I built what I could." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway, and he was not a man who showed much, but he was showing this. "It's a room that says you live here," he said. "Not that you're staying here, that you live here." He paused. "I want to ask you properly, when you're ready to be asked, but I wanted you to see this first." She looked at the window that faced the sunrise. She thought about the eastbound train schedule on the wall of the Silver Hollow station and the $11 in her pocket, and Chester Puit saying, "I can't marry that," loud enough for the world to hear. She thought about all the distance between that moment and this one, and how none of it had been the distance she had planned to travel, and how the place she had arrived at was not the place she had aimed for, and how none of that made it wrong. It made it better, in a way she would not have known to ask for. "Show me where you want the bed," she said. He let out a breath that he had been holding, she suspected, for most of 2 months. He stepped into the room and pointed to the east wall, under the window, where the morning light would come in first, and she looked at where he pointed and nodded, and they stood together in the room that was hers now, that had been made for her out of the accumulated evidence of a man deciding what mattered to him, and the lantern light held them both in it, warm and steady, for a little while. He asked her on a Saturday in September, not with ceremony, not with the kind of staging that makes a moment feel performed rather than real. He asked her the way he did most things that mattered, plainly, after thinking about it long enough to be certain, in the middle of ordinary life rather than in a pause from it. They were checking the east pasture fence together, the same fence she had helped him repair in that first brutal cold snap almost a year before. The morning was cool, but not cold. The particular quality of early Wyoming autumn, where the air had made its intention clear, but hadn't yet committed to the full weight of what was coming. She was walking the line, and he was walking beside her, and he said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the girls, though they are a reason. Not because of the ranch, though that's part of our life. Because I want you as my wife. Because I have watched you for nearly a year and I know who you are and I want that to be the thing I'm building my life next to." He paused. "I'm not going to pretend I'm easy to live with." "I already live with you," she said. "I have a working sample." "Then you know what you're getting." "I know what I'm getting," she said. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at the fence line and she saw in his profile the particular expression that was his version of relief. Not dramatic, just a slight loosening of the jaw, a breath that came more easily. He reached out and took her hand the way he had that evening at the table months ago, and they stood in the east pasture with the Wyoming sky doing its enormous indifferent thing above them, and she thought, this is what I have. This is what I built out of $11 and a broken plan and a train platform in a town I'd never heard of. It wasn't what she had packed herself up for. It was better than what she had packed herself up for. And she knew that now with the clarity that only comes from having been in a place long enough to understand what it actually is, as opposed to what you expected it to be. They told the girls that evening at dinner. Ruby said, "I know," with the unshakable composure of a child who has been predicting this outcome for months and sees no reason to be surprised by its confirmation. Hazel said nothing for a moment. She processed things internally first, always. And then she got up from her chair and walked around the table and put her arms around Eliza's neck from behind with the full, wordless commitment of a 7-year-old who has made a decision. Eliza held Hazel's arms over her shoulders and looked at Silas across the table, and he looked at her, and it was a quiet moment and a complete one. "Can we get a dog now?" Ruby said. Silas looked at her. "What does a dog have to do with any of this?" "We're a proper family now," Ruby said. "Proper families have dogs." "We have 3 horses, 11 cattle, and 9 chickens," Silas said. "Those are work animals," Ruby said. "A dog would be for us." She had the expression she wore when she had already made up her mind and was simply managing the timing of the outcome. "I've been thinking of Blue Heeler." Eliza made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in its vicinity. "We'll discuss it," Silas said. Ruby accepted this as an intermediate victory and went back to her dinner. The wedding was set for October, which gave Silver Hollow 4 weeks to develop opinions about it, which it did with the thoroughness of a community that takes its opinions seriously. The weight of those opinions had shifted so completely from what it had been a year ago that Eliza sometimes thought about the 2 women at Fitch's fabric counter and what they were making of this, and then decided she didn't need to know and moved on. Mrs. Pryor was the one who organized the practical aspects, because Mrs. Pryor organized practical aspects the way rivers organized water, by nature, without needing to be asked. She appeared at the ranch 2 weeks before the wedding with a list and a manner that brooked no argument, and Eliza received her with the warm respect she had developed for a woman who operated on principle and delivered what she promised. "People want to bring food," Mrs. Pryor said. "I've told them you don't want to fuss. They're bringing food anyway. I thought you should know." "I don't mind food," Eliza said. "Good, because there will be a great deal of it." Mrs. Pryor looked at her over the list. "The Hendersons want to come. The Calloway family. Fitch and his wife. Most of the families from the Thursday lessons." She paused. "Chester Puitt has not been mentioned." "He won't come," Eliza said. "No," Mrs. Pryor agreed. "He won't." She said it without elaboration, because there was nothing to elaborate. Chester Puitt had spent the better part of a year watching what Eliza Rowan had built from the circumstances he had created with his public rejection of her. And whatever he felt about it, whatever story he told himself in private about the choice he'd made on that train platform, he had sense enough to keep it to himself. She did not wish him ill. She had realized, somewhere in the course of building an actual life, that the ill she might have wished him had simply become irrelevant, crowded out by things that mattered more. Clara came from Pennsylvania. That had been arranged in the letter Eliza sent in August, the one where she'd written, "I think I am just beginning," and Clara had written back with the brevity of a woman who knows her sister well. I'll be there in October. Tell me the date and where to get off the train. She arrived on a Thursday, 3 days before the wedding, on the same train line that had brought Eliza to Silver Hollow a year ago. Eliza drove to the station herself. She stood on the platform. The same boards, the gap still there in the third plank from the water barrel, though someone had partially filled it with gravel. And she waited for the train, and when it came in, she watched the passengers disembark. And there was Clara, a year older and traveling light, carrying the same kind of worn suitcase that practical women carry. And when she saw Eliza, her face did the thing that Clara's face did when she was relieved but would not say so directly. They embraced. Clara held on longer than she usually did. You look different, Clara said, pulling back and looking at her. I've been outdoors more. Not that, Clara said. You look settled, like you know where you're standing. Eliza thought about this. I do, she said. Get your bag. She drove Clara back to the ranch, and she watched Clara's face take in the kitchen garden in its autumn state, the repaired lean-to, the barn and the fences, the cabin with the blue curtains. She watched Clara form impressions and file them without comment, the way she had always done, and she waited. Clara met Silas at the door. He shook her hand and said, She talks about you. Clara looked at Eliza, and Eliza looked at the fence line. Clara met the girls at dinner, which was the proper test of character as far as the girls were concerned, because dinner was when you had to participate in conversation rather than just observe it. Ruby asked Clara 17 questions, several of which were impertinent, all of which Clara answered directly. Hazel offered Clara the last of the cornbread, which was a significant gesture that Ruby understood and pointed out was significant, which Hazel said was not something that needed to be announced. That night, when the girls were asleep and Silas was in the barn doing the last check of the evening, Clara sat with Eliza at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea and said what she'd been thinking since the train platform. I was afraid, Clara said, when you wrote that first letter, about Chester Puett, about coming out here. I know. I thought you'd be back in Pennsylvania by Christmas. I thought so too, Eliza said, for about 20 minutes. What stopped you? Eliza thought about this, about Silas Boone at the end of the platform saying hard welcome with no pity in it, about the wagon ride east with the mended coat elbows and the ordinary horse, about 2 small faces in a doorway and a hand in hers before she'd earned it. Someone showed me a place where what I actually was would be useful, she said. Not what I looked like, not what I matched on paper, what I actually was. She turned the teacup in her hands. That's rarer than it should be. Clara looked at her for a moment. Is he good to you? He's honest with me, Eliza said. He's consistent. He shows me things rather than saying them, and he means what he shows. She paused. He built me a room. Clara blinked. A room? A room with a window facing east, Eliza said, because I'd mentioned once that I like morning light. I mentioned it once, months before, and he remembered and he built it, and he didn't say anything about it until it was done. Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the blue curtains. She looked at the shelf on the wall where Eliza's sewing kit sat next to the household accounts book. She looked at the kitchen that had the character of a room where someone cooked with attention, where things were placed with the logic of someone who understood how a house worked and had made it work. Chester Puett, Clara said finally, is a very stupid man. He made a decision based on incomplete information, Eliza said. Most people do. You're being generous. I'm being accurate, Eliza said. If he hadn't done what he did on that platform, I would have married him and been adequate, and neither of us would have known what I was actually capable of. She looked at her sister. I'm not grateful to him, but I understand the sequence. Clara drank her tea. She said, Mama would have liked it here. Eliza looked at the fire. She would have liked that you fixed the lean-to yourself, Clara said. She would have told everyone. A pause. She would have said you got stubborn enough to deserve something good. She always called it stubborn. Because that's what she called it in herself, Clara said. She would have called it something else in you eventually. She set down her cup. I'm going to call it what it is. It's courage. Dull, daily courage. The kind that doesn't get noticed until you look back at it from far enough away. The wedding was on a Saturday, which was the day that worked for the most people and also the day that the weather had agreed to cooperate. Cool and clear. The sky, the particular blue that Wyoming produced on its best autumn days, the kind of sky that looked like it had been designed for maximum effect and then worn in for years until it looked natural. The ceremony was held in the yard of the Boone Ranch because that was the obvious place, the place that was both of theirs, and what had been a working yard looked, not transformed, not dressed up beyond recognition, but like itself on a day when itself had decided to be at its best. Mrs. Pryor had organized the arrangement of chairs borrowed from 3 different households. Thomas Henderson had arrived early to help carry them, and Hazel had spent the morning directing him with the precise authority of someone who has decided this is their jurisdiction, which Thomas bore with the good nature of a young man who owed his ability to read a ledger to the woman getting married and understood this was reciprocal work. Ruby had wanted a blue heeler puppy at the wedding. This had been declined. She had accepted the decline with the composure of someone who has identified this as a negotiation rather than a final verdict. Eliza dressed in her room, her real room, the one with the east window, where the morning light had been coming in for 6 weeks now, and where her things had settled into the space with the naturalness of things that belong there. She wore the dress she had made herself from the deep green wool she had bought in Silver Hollow 3 months before with the bread money, and Clara stood behind her and fixed the buttons that Eliza couldn't reach, and the two of them looked in the small mirror on the wall, and Eliza thought, this is the woman who stepped off a train with $11, same nose with the bump from the fence fall, same hair that refused to cooperate, though Clara had gotten it into something more structured than usual. Same clear gray eyes that her mother had said showed someone honest, different in the ways that a year of hard work and genuine belonging changes a person, not in the face so much as in the way the face carried itself. The wariness was gone, not naivety in its place. She was not a naive woman and never had been, but something more like the ease of a person who has stopped waiting for the next thing to go wrong and started simply being where they are. Ready? Clara said. Since October, Eliza said, and meant it. Silas at the front of the assembled chairs looked the way Silas looked when he had made a decision and was committed to it entirely, steady, present, his good coat brushed and his hair cut by Eliza herself the previous evening, which had involved more negotiation than she had expected from a man who claimed not to have opinions about his hair. He watched her walk across the yard, and she watched him watch her, and what she saw on his face was not nerves or performance or the particular brightness of someone showing emotion for an audience. It was just him, recognizing her, the way he had recognized her the first day at the end of the Silver Hollow platform. The same quality of seeing. The justice of the peace was a man named Claret, who rode circuit through 3 counties and had performed enough frontier weddings to have developed a style that was brief, sincere, and uncluttered by ornament, which suited both of them. He said what needed to be said. They said what needed to be said back. When it was done, Hazel cried, silently and privately, in the way she did things that mattered to her, turned slightly away from everyone, not asking for acknowledgement. Ruby did not cry. Ruby watched the whole proceeding with the focused attention of someone committing it to long-term memory, which was her way of honoring things. Clara cried without apology, which was her way. The food arrived the way Mrs. Pryor had predicted, in overwhelming quantity, contributed by everyone who had come to know the Boone Ranch over the past year. The Henderson family brought smoked ham. The Callaways brought a cake that was imperfect in shape and very good in flavor. 3 families from the Thursday lessons brought bread, not in deference to Eliza's baking, just in the way of communities where everyone contributes what they have. Fitch and his wife brought 2 bottles of something that had come a long way to get to Wyoming and had been worth the trip. They ate and talked in the yard through the afternoon, and Eliza moved through it all with the particular clarity of a person who is experiencing something rather than managing it. She talked to Thomas Henderson about the delivery ledger and whether he wanted to expand the route come spring. She talked to Mrs. Pryor about the county's plans for a schoolhouse, which had progressed from rumor to actual correspondence between the settlement committee and the territorial government. She held a conversation with 2 7-year-olds from the Thursday lessons about whether their arithmetic would eventually become useful, and she told them yes, it would become the most useful thing they knew, and they received this with the mixed trust of children who believe a teacher approximately half the time. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, she found herself standing with Silas at the edge of the yard, just briefly, where they could see the east pasture and the fence line they had walked together in the morning. He said, "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I'm good," he said. And then, because he was Silas Boone and he said things when he had things to say, I want to tell you that you're the best decision I've made since I came to Wyoming. She looked at him. That's a significant field, she said. You built a ranch. That's work, he said. You're a choice. He said it without drama, just as a distinction he had thought through and wanted to be clear about. Work is something you do because it's in front of you. A choice is something you decide on. I chose you, deliberately. She thought about what he'd said and what it meant, and then she thought about what she had chosen, and how choosing it had required her to be in a place she hadn't chosen, and to stay in it past the point when the original reason for being there had collapsed, and how the staying was the thing that had made everything else possible. I know, she said. I chose you deliberately, too. He took her hand. They stood at the edge of the east pasture yard and looked at the fence they had fixed together and the land they were accountable to together, and the afternoon light came across it in the particular gold of Wyoming autumn, long and without apology. There are things about this kind of story that are easy to misread. The easiest misread is the most comfortable one, that Eliza Rowan won, that Chester Puett lost, that the woman who was publicly dismissed proved her worth and was recognized, and that's the shape of it. Victory over humiliation, the rejected woman triumphant. That's not quite the shape of it. What actually happened was simpler and harder. A woman arrived in an unfamiliar place with less than she needed and no backup plan, and she chose every morning to do the work that was in front of her. She didn't wait for permission to be useful. She didn't compress herself into the space that had been offered to her. She understood that spaces expand when you treat them like they should. She fixed things that needed fixing, built things that needed building, taught what she knew, fought what needed fighting, and she did it all with the steadiness of someone who had decided a long time ago that steadiness was the form that courage took in daily life. Chester Puett's assessment of her was not wrong in a simple way. He looked at her and he didn't see value, and there's a particular kind of human failure in that. The failure to see past surface to substance. The failure to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what's underneath it. He made his calculation on the platform in 30 seconds and acted on it publicly, which meant that when the calculation proved wrong, it proved wrong publicly too. But the more interesting thing is not Chester Puett. The interesting thing is Silas Boone standing at the end of the platform saying, hard, welcome with no pity in it. The interesting thing is the decision he made in that moment, not to rescue her, not to extend charity, but to recognize what he was actually looking at and respond to what was actually there. That kind of seeing is not common. It's a form of intelligence that gets less credit than it deserves because it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly produces better outcomes. And the most interesting thing of all is Eliza herself, who arrived broken in the way that honest plans are broken when they meet reality, not shattered, just differently shaped now, and who decided, in the arithmetic of a train schedule and $11 and a stranger's offer of honest work, that what was in front of her was worth staying for. Not because it was what she'd planned, because she could see what it was. That's the rarer skill. Not finding what you were looking for, but recognizing what you've found. The Thursday lessons continued through that winter and into the next year, and eventually became the formal start of the Silver Hollow Schoolhouse, which was built in the spring with contributions from 11 families and county money that Mrs. Pryor had organized through correspondence that she conducted with the calm persistence of a woman who understands that officials respond to thoroughness. Eliza taught in it without abandoning the ranch, because she had always understood that those two things were not in competition. Thomas Henderson, by the following year, was managing his father's accounts and had started teaching the youngest children himself on Friday mornings, which Eliza considered the proper measure of having done something right. Ruby got the blue heeler. She named him August. For the month she decided she would have eventually gotten him, whether anyone agreed or not. He was exactly as useful and chaotic as a working dog on a ranch, and he slept on Ruby's feet every night without exception. Hazel, in the spring after the wedding, asked Eliza to teach her to sew. She learned with the methodical patience she brought to addition, slowly, correctly, without shortcuts. Her first finished project was a small pouch for her collection of smooth stones, which was flawed at the seams and completely functional, and which she carried for years. When Eliza told her it was well done, Hazel received the praise with the serious containment of someone who intended to do better, which was the truest compliment anyone could have paid the work. Silas learned to sleep through the night. This happened gradually, without being declared, and Eliza knew it had happened when she realized she hadn't heard him on the porch in the dark for 3 months. She said nothing about it. She thought about it often. The ranch continued. Good years and difficult years, because that's what ranches do. They cycle through seasons that cooperate and seasons that don't, prices that recover and prices that test you, animals that thrive and animals that don't make it through a hard winter. Eliza kept her records. She baked twice a week. She fought what needed fighting and fixed what needed fixing and planted in the spring with the reliable faith of someone who has learned that the ground will produce if you give it what it needs and the patience to wait. She wrote to Clara every month. Clara wrote back every month. Their mother had been right that honest correspondence is a form of love that endures distance, and they practiced it faithfully. On the first anniversary of their wedding, Silas gave her a gift that she had not expected, a proper writing desk, small and well-made, positioned in her room under the east window where the morning light fell across it. She stood and looked at it and looked at him. "For the records," he said. "The records are in the kitchen accounts book," she said. "They should be somewhere better," he said. "You've been keeping them on the kitchen table." She looked at the desk again. She thought about all the things she had written on that kitchen table. The household accounts, the water use logs, the letter to Clara that had tried to explain something she hadn't yet fully understood about where she was and why she was staying. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with the full weight of what the desk was. Not the desk itself, but the recognition it carried. That what she did was worth a proper place. That her work was seen. He nodded and went to start the morning chores because he was Silas Boone and declarations were things he made once and then returned to work. She sat at the desk. She opened the accounts book to a fresh page. She wrote the date and the current inventory and the weather and the state of the east pasture fence. And then she paused and wrote at the bottom of the page, in small letters, "1 year here. Everything I built is still standing." She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the book. Outside, Hazel and Ruby were already arguing. From the distance and the pitch, it sounded like the chickens again, which had remained a renewable source of jurisdictional dispute despite all resolution attempts. August the blue heeler was barking at something irrelevant in the north fence line. Silas was in the barn, the familiar sounds of the morning work coming through the cold air. She got up. She went to start the fire and put the water on and begin the bread dough that would rise by mid-morning. She moved through the kitchen with the ease of a woman in her own house, knowing where everything was, knowing what came next, knowing the place the way you know something you have built with your own hands. Not perfectly, not without its complications, but deeply, truly, in the way that knowledge becomes part of you. The woman who arrived in Silver Hollow, Wyoming, with $11 and a broken plan never got what she came for. She got something she never thought to ask for, which turned out to be the same thing, only real.